On this week's The Next Interview with host Doland White, you'll hear Nick Jonsson explain exactly why leadership feels lonely at the top and how leaders rebuild trust, health, and purpose without losing credibility.
Well, welcome to the Next Interview Show podcast. As the announcer mentioned when we came through the front door, I am Doland White. I am the host of the podcast, and I'm always blessed to have amazing conversations with industry experts and leaders, global leaders. And in particularly today, I'm joined with Nick Jonsson, and Nick is here. Nick is you said you were in Thailand as we're kind of talking right now. So I want to start with just a little bit of gratitude. I know it's 6 o'clock in the morning for you, kind of around in that area, and 2 in the afternoon for me. But there's 1,000 other places you could be, especially at 6 o'clock in the morning, doing other things. So thank you for taking time to be here with me today and share your wisdom and advice with leaders and help me move my mission forward with empowering 1 million leaders. So thanks for being here, sir.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome, Doland.
It's good to have you. So I have a little bio about just to introduce Nick for those of you who've not met him, and then Nick will kind of give a little bit more about his background. But one of the things that I really like that we're going to talk about these are topics that most leaders don't talk about. Most leaders feel like there's a stoic nature. I'm a leader, and therefore I'm going to be square-jawed and lock-eyed, and so we're going to spend some time today talking authentically about isolation, fear, some of the things that leaders experience. And you've written a book. The book is called Executive Loneliness: The 5 Pathways to Overcoming Isolation, Stress, Anxiety, and Depression in the Modern Business World. And that's a lot of stuff to overcome, by the way. So that's a big list. So we'll spend some time kind of talking about that. And then the 5 steps in the book that you look to kind of help people do that and share your experience. But before we get too far down the path, for those that have not met you, I think it would be great for you to share just a little bit about your background, your history, kind of what brought you to this, and what there's always a purpose behind a book. There's a reason why we do things that we do. Sometimes it eludes my wife on the things that I do, but I thought it would be a good opportunity to maybe have you kind of talk about that, your background, and kind of what brought you to the book.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Doland.
You're welcome.
So indeed, and I was born in Sweden, educated in Australia, and then I spent the last sort of 20 plus years in Southeast Asia, mainly to work. In summary then, growing up in Sweden, a socially distant country, being an introvert, cold and dark country, I was sort of striving, always to get away. So when I had a chance to move to Australia to study at university, then I took that chance. And then I haven't really been home apart from holidays since. So,
wow.
Yeah. So I fell in love with the weather, sunnier and warmer. And that's why I'm based in Asia now. I started in PR, marketing, advertising, sales, entertaining clients and so on. And I was pretty good at that. It worked, building relationships and so on was something that was close to my heart. And while it worked really well with the clients and so on, perhaps internally in the organizations, being that introvert, I was feeling a bit lonely. I felt a bit out of place sometimes. I was not comfortable to have the difficult conversation with my bosses. I could have a barbecue with them on the weekend at home and having great conversations, but to knock their door when they were busy and raise difficult conversations was something I struggled with. So that's just to set the scene, perhaps, of the conversation we're going to have today. And also the reason why I wrote a book on executive loneliness, because as you will learn is that I interviewed a lot of executives around loneliness in the workplace, and I found that I wasn't alone. I found that about 30% of senior leaders had feelings of isolation and loneliness into the workplace.
That's fascinating. So having been, as we kind of were chatting a little bit before we hit go on the podcast, I retired in April of 2024, and that lasted about a week. And And then, of course, the podcast launched, and I do coaching and other kinds of things on the side. But having been a CEO and a COO and run and done those kinds of things, I think loneliness is it'll be an interesting conversation. But I'm very interested in what you learn from some of the executives that you talk to, Nick, because loneliness is one of those things that isn't discussed. It's not an open conversation, and there's that old axiom of it's lonely at the top. And it is lonely at the top. So what prompted you to kind of start those conversations with other, to go interview other executives and have the conversations around loneliness? What kind of opened that door for you?
Yeah, so in my corporate job and the last role in particular, I started to also have some self-doubt at the time, and at that time I didn't know how to cope with it because I didn't talk to someone about my loneliness and isolation. It sort of compounded, and I started to go to the bar after work to drink alcohol to deal with my emotions and feelings, and of course that was not a healthy coping mechanism, but it's easy. A bad habit can turn over to addiction. So that's what happened with me. And then I had a bad stint when I fell down and I hit my rock bottom, as to say. And once I crawled out of that, that's when I really wanted to explore and see if I was the only one to go through this, and if I wanted to also extend my hand to help others. And 1 year later, and into my recovery, something happened, and I lost a friend of mine in Singapore at the time to suicide.
Yeah.
And that was the wake-up call. That's when I said, this has to stop. And I then became a fundraiser and a volunteer for a suicide hotline in Singapore. And I got more and more engaged in these conversations and realized that this is a big problem. And that's when I started to then do a survey, just creating a basic survey, sent it out to my network. And I was quite shocked by the response, the positive response, people asking, me more questions and thanking me for doing this. The last question then was also, would you be open to have a coffee with me to have a more in-depth conversation? And the answers there blow me away. I was busy for many weeks just having coffees with people, hearing them, and many of them spilling out their heart on how they have gone through similar feelings as I had.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. One of the things I think you'll see me every now and then jot something down. At my age, if I don't write it down, I won't remember to ask you. But one of the things I think, Nick, that's interesting to kind of go back to in that is kind of that sense of probably not a correct word in English, but the fact that it's an epidemic. And usually when there's an epidemic, in a lot of cases, it's just not plainly spoken about. So when you started I'm just curious, when you kind of started really working with or talking with executives about loneliness, how hesitant were some of the executives to chat with you? Or did they see it as a point of relief that finally I have someone who understands this and is willing to share with me?
Yeah, so here is the very interesting thing. I knew many of these people for quite some time. We had strong relationships, but I had, until that point, never heard about their feelings on loneliness and their insecurities. And the fact that I played the first card, the fact that I was vulnerable, I shared that I gone through a difficult patch. Yeah. And I now want to find out if this is something that is common in the workplace. And I shared what I shared with you and the listeners today. I said I went through this phase and I turned to alcohol. That was my coping mechanism.
Right.
And they felt safe. The fact that I shared a little bit what I was going through, I did a self-disclosure, that set them up for being vulnerable back to me. And I think here is a lesson for anyone who's listening, and we can use this for any relationship in our life. It can be with our family, it can be with our colleagues. If we are human, if we are showing that we have gone through a difficult patch and we are vulnerable about it, then the other person naturally will feel safe to be vulnerable back to us. And that's the beginning when we can build a strong relationship.
Yeah, I think that's really important, Nick, because I think that's that fact that we're willing, or you were willing to be vulnerable, set that framework for trust. And there's that. I think there's the sometimes in the back of an executive's mind, or anybody in your family or in anyone else, about there's always that question about how much can I trust you? How much, if I tell you these things, can I trust that it's going to stay between us, or whatever they're concerned about, that they can actually have that trusted conversation. When as you kind of went through it, and I love your analogy. Matter of fact, I made a note, and I'll warn you right now, I'm probably going to claim your coffee with me idea for a couple of things that I'm doing too. But I'll give you credit where the idea came from. But the kind of as you started to have those conversations, what did you find? I think there's an arc as executives progress in their career, right? And where responsibilities increase, the numbers get bigger, the number of employees get bigger. Did you see any correlation between size of company and feelings of isolation and stress, or did you see that kind of as something that was endemic regardless of the size of the organization?
It can be in any size of the organization, and it all comes down to the culture. We call it today psychological safety, right? Or team psychological safety.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, and it's also, it's in the family, it's in a company, it's in the community. If the leader is someone in that team or that company who is vulnerable, who is open, who admits their mistake, who say, I don't know the answer to this, can you help me?
Yeah.
If that leader is vulnerable, then they set the scene for that whole organization. What I saw was that it can be a huge organization with thousands of people, where in general people are not open or vulnerable or feel safe. Mm-hmm. But it can be a team there, a pocket inside that company where that leader for that team is vulnerable and have created a safe culture for them inside that little space. So in that sense, it's really up to all of us as our leaders of our families or companies or teams.
So how do you help individuals? So it's interesting you mentioned that, Nick, because I think one of the things that does happen is you may have you mentioned culture, right? Culture is what drives the behavior and the values of an organization. So culturally, the leader may say, hey, I'm going to be vulnerable, and they're really not. But there's pockets of vulnerability in the organization. So there's like little layers. How can people thrive inside of, any suggestions for how people thrive where that vulnerability doesn't permeate the entire structure, but it's in their little pocket, knowing that outside of that pocket, it may not be, that may not be valid.
Yeah, you can only influence what you can at your space, right? And I talk about vulnerability as training the vulnerability muscle, and it's almost like we go to the gym and we train our muscles. It's the same with vulnerability. It's like a dance back and forward, and it takes some time to build that trust. And we also have to be careful with oversharing. There's nothing that is perhaps a bigger turnoff than someone coming into the office on a Monday morning and spilling out the whole heart, oversharing what's happening. That is not vulnerability. Vulnerability is about talking about work-related challenges, someone who's been delegated a task, dare to say, thank you for giving me this. I'm a bit insecure here. I'm not really sure about this. Can you help me with this? Or the leader is stepping forward and say, hey, team, we have a challenge here, and I don't have the answers. Okay, I would need your help here. That is the vulnerability we're talking about. And what I also seen that if we build it in a pocket, if we build it in a part of organization, it's that spread, that trust, that feeling will positively spread right to the rest of the organizations. And it's about having these conversations and sharing best practice with other teams, and eventually people might get the courage to be vulnerable as well.
Yeah, I like that. I think a lot of times there are those, and maybe, at least I've seen in my organizations, when I've arrived and assumed a leadership role, or I'm replacing a legacy leader that wasn't necessarily quite as open, that it first of all, it can be a little bit of a shock, I think, to organizations when the kind of vulnerability that you talk about. And I had to smile a little bit because yes, the one thing about when you come in, you show up on a Monday morning and you spill your guts, it can be, it can be a little bit of a challenging for that person that you're doing that with. So it can take them completely by surprise, and not be as effective as you thought it was going to be. But it's interesting. I always kind of considered it like planting seeds, and it's growth by example. If you can be vulnerable with your team, even though it may be a small pocket, that gives that opportunity for that team then to spread, and the word spreads, because people have a tendency to talk, right? They're not always, they share things going on inside of their group, and the groups then in turn begin to grow. One thing that I do want to, I want to kind of dive into, there's five things in your book. And I love the 5 steps that you have in your book. I'm a big fan of, I'm 72. So in my mind, I like to keep things very simple, and because it just is easier. But one of the very first one that you talk about is taking stock. And I think that's hard for people to do in a self-honest capacity. So how do you when you're working or talking with people, how do you kind of help begin that process with taking stock? So where are you really, and acknowledge it?
Yeah, so it's about doing that self-audit, right? And if we imagine that we run a business, and if we have a shop, there will always be some stock take, there will be some audits. We know the inventory, we know what's there.
Yeah.
But as human beings, we rarely do that. We rarely look ourselves in the mirror. And here is about really taking that honest look at ourselves. And there's 2 parts to this. One is where we can do an assessment, and I have this self-assessment, Donald, which I introduced you to also, which is the limitless self-assessment, which divides our life down in all the 8 key areas, because so often we are so focused on business and career, and then we think that it's work-life balance, as we also chatted about. But I'm here to say that life is more than work and just life. And it's all life, as you said also, Donald. And it's about breaking that down then and looking at our business and career, but also finances, our health, family and health, friends, relationships, romance, personal growth, spirituality, fun and recreation, and our physical environment. And once we take an honest look at ourselves there, and we can do this easily on a scale of 1 to 10, then we're getting sort of the view of where we are at the moment.
Yeah, I like that, because it's, as we were talking earlier, kind of before we hit go, about the fact that one of the things I love talking about is the fact that there's no such thing as work-life balance. Work is a component of life. And if you're out of alignment in all of these pieces, and by the way, so those of you listening to the podcast, I'm gonna do a little shameless plug for Nick's assessment. Go to nickjonsson.com. The link will be in the podcast notes. Go get it there. If you're driving your car, please don't try to write it down while you're driving. Please focus on the road. But go to that site, take the assessment. It takes just a few minutes, but it's an assessment that will make you take pause and think about the domains of your life, because we tend to reference, when we think about how am I in business, but these are all of the things. They all add up to the sum of what our life is like. I love the question about relationship. I'm probably not going to let my wife take it, but I took the assessment. So I like that, but I do think that's one of the things that, and that's probably for taking stock, that just as I'm thinking about it now out loud, I would recommend people to go do that, just to begin that taking stock process. Because I don't think we do that. I have to remind myself to do that. To go spend time and sit down and actually take stock of what's good that's gone on, and where do I need to focus, and how do I sharpen my saw, and what about family? And it's a good place to start.
Yeah, and I do this with individuals, but I also do it with teams when we do trainings and workshops and so on. This is typically a pre-workshop assessment, and I ask everyone to then print out the results and bring it in. And that means also that I'm collecting a lot of data, so I can see trends, what is happening. As I've done this with thousands of leaders now, I can see the trend. And the trend that I'm seeing out there is that and we look at the biggest gap. So first we look at, this is where I am now. Then what's my desired score? Where would I like to go here? And then we look at the biggest gap. And the biggest gap that I'm seeing, and there's probably not a surprise, is in health. The biggest gap in general of leaders is in health.
Yeah.
And where's the smallest gap? It's in business and career. So what's the story that we have here? It means that actually we are building a business and career at the expense of our health. That is a big trend that I'm seeing. And is that really the person I want to be?
Yeah. I love that, because there are, in business, one of the things that happens in business, and I've been guilty of this in my career, Nick, where the needs of the business outweigh your personal needs. You assume they do. So we forget about it happens every time you get on an airplane. Every time you get on an airplane, one of the things they say is put your oxygen mask on first. Don't put yours on. Then you can take care of everybody else around you. But without that, so one of the as I kind of want to go down through these, and the next one, and we'll get into health, but asking for help, and I think leaders. There's a thing that I teach when I'm working with my clients called the 5 lies, and one of the 5 lies is that the leader believes that they know it all. That if they ask for help, it's a sign of weakness or a sign that they're worried about a punitive thing happening to them. Something bad's going to happen. So I love the kind of your thinking around breaking the shame barrier, kind of moving away from asking for help. So when you're working for that, how do you help someone, a leader, kind of shift their thinking around that topic?
Yeah, so asking for help is a tough one, and it's always easy if we can be proactive about this, because if we build our vulnerability and our trust in our relationships, and we have that safety network in the good times, then when the bad times come, because they will come, because that's life, then we naturally have built all these connections and relationships, so we're going to open up about it. And of course, these days, many leaders are proactive. They have a coach, they have mentors, they belong to a peer group, a mastermind, and they have all these pockets of safety. Mm-hmm. And then it's much easier than once those established, and you can ask for help. So you can do that with an audit. When here are my gaps. Well, I currently have, a score of my health is sitting at the 5 now. I wanted my health to be 9. And then it's to ask, what does a 9 look like? And then what's the path there? Well, who can help you with this? Is it joining a gym? Is it getting a personal trainer? And those are conversations, of course, coaching conversations that we can have.
Yeah, I love that. That's good. Those are good. That's a good path of that conversation so that it's leveraging everything kind of into a seamless thread. The next one that you had, and we kind of got into this one a little bit, which is getting healthy, because I call it falling off the wagon. And being the first person to kind of go, yeah, maybe sometimes I do too. I think there's not necessarily a correlation from a leader's perspective. Leaders are taught. When we teach leaders, or when I was taught leadership, we're taught how to communicate and how to behave and how to appear and how to do all of these wonderful things. But health isn't one of the things that is a component. It doesn't come up in order as a component to be a good leader. You got to be healthy.
Absolutely. So getting healthy for me was what really made a difference to me. I really had to take ownership for then my bad habits. I had to change my food habits. I was about 60 pounds bigger than I am now when I was in the corporate world 10 years ago. I was, as I mentioned before, drinking too much alcohol, and I had to just take ownership for these and just sort them out and get healthier. And I look a lot at professional athletes these days, and a professional athlete, they are training most of the time, then they show up for a competition and they deliver and perform. But as an executive or as an entrepreneur or business owners, we're always performing. We're always delivering. We also need that time to be healthy. We need to be in a good time, a good space to, have the good thinking. And the best thinking, and I say this, is when we are exercising, when we're out for that walk, when we're out in the nature. That's when we have that strategic CEO mindset. The creativity comes in then. When we're on our computer, in the office, on the keyboard, or in a meeting, I say we are the administrator, we are the manager. So if we want to perform at our best, it is about taking that step back and seeing the bigger picture and allocate the time needed daily to move, even if that means moving, walking around for half an hour, 1 hour in the nature.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's probably an excuse you hear pretty frequently about, I don't have time. Time is the enemy of being healthy. I don't have time, right? Which is that lack of commitment to managing, to controlling your own time. So, or at least allocating time. So which opens up, we'll digress away a little bit from the next two, but just kind of on that issue of time, and particularly with getting healthy as an example. I think one of the things that leaders have a challenge with, and thank you for your comment around when you're at the keyboard and when you're doing stuff, you're managing, right? You're resourcing, you're doing stuff and not stepping back and leading or thinking about the things that you could be doing. How do you help that leader kind of answer that objection, when it is that time spot, so they know where they're investing time? They can recognize that I could be doing different things with my time, because we get comfortable. It's comfortable to be at the keyboard.
Yeah, and I link it also back to the social health, and social health is very, very crucial as well, and that will come soon on the next step also. But it's about, finding some hobbies, some interests that you have that we can double down on. So in my case, I encourage any leader to rejoin the sports and clubs and associations which they belong to as a teenager. They will have classes for adults as well. In my case, I joined swim academies again. I signed up for cycle clubs, cycle groups. I joined the running clubs, and I did this in multiple cities around the world where I travel a lot. So whenever I go there, I will reach out before and say, hey, I'm coming to Istanbul next week, and I'm checking in with a running club. Where are the runs? Where's the meeting point? And I will use that as my way of exploring the city, meeting up with some people and so on. And when I'm home, I belong to multiple clubs and associations, and I stick these in my calendar on recurrence, and some of my training blocks are on recurrence for the rest of my life. Because if I want to be that CEO, if I want to be that creative guy, then I shouldn't just sit and administrate. So it's about getting that infrastructure and the discipline in to make it happen.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, it's that willingness to make it non-negotiable, to block that in the calendar and make it part of who you are and what you do. So there's the old adage, I guess, Nick, of, it takes 21 days to create a habit, which is a lie, by the way, because it takes more than 21 days. But it is making it so that it becomes non-negotiable and it's wired into who you are, to your being. So you becomes it. I love your idea around that, though, too. And for those leaders that are traveling leaders, as you're listening to, it's the same sort of thing when you develop those habits in the cities that you go to. One of my favorite things I was blessed earlier in most of my career. I traveled about 80%. So I've been all over the world. One of my favorite things to do was would go on walkabout. Whatever city I was in, at least part of the time I was there was dedicated to walk, and it was a good 4 or 5, 6 hour walk, and go see things I'd never seen before. Australia was one of them. Singapore's another. Those are awesome places. We'll find out where in Australia you're from, but we'll get to that in a minute. The next one is all about nurturing healthy relationships. And I think a lot of times, when I saw a relationship, of course, the space in my life, my relationships are a little different. I have executive relationships and business relationships, my wife and my grandkids and children and all of those kinds of things. So you are, in the book, you talk about building trust. It's at home, it's at work, and it's all over the place. And how do you help that executive understand kind of the importance of the word nurturing? Because we can build a relationship, but we don't nurture it. We don't come back to it. I think a lot of times professionally, it's a one and done kind of a thing.
Yeah, and it comes back to the vulnerability here again. And we might have some good relationships, some friends which we maybe played golf with for 20 years.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
we speak about sport and we have a good time, we have a fun time. But perhaps we weren't vulnerable. Perhaps we didn't give them a chance to actually go deeper. So it's nurturing here means really being a bit more honest, taking the relationship to the next level, being more human. But I also found that it also meant to make amends, because there might be things
Mm.
that we have said to someone, some pain we are carrying with us that is still there. And in this process, what I did and what I do with my coaching clients is really to ask them to map out the key relationships in their life and asking them, is there some pain there? And many times when we do that, we will find out that they might not have spoken to the sister for 2 years. Maybe for 5 years they haven't said hello to the neighbor. Maybe there was something in that,
Yeah.
some painful incident, and they have just left it alone. But the fact that we remember that means that we carry that pain with us all the time. So it's about also then together, and this is best done with a coach or a sponsor or a mentor, to have
Sure.
a conversation here to make sure that we don't go back and make amends and make more pain. But if it's okay, if it's a relationship, the person is still healthy and alive, then we have a chance to go back and make amends and apologize. And I had to do that myself, and that
Oh,
is very relieving to do that. And I remember I made amends with my sister because I had gone through a difficult patch and I wasn't at my best self, and I behaved a bit strangely sometimes, and it was my chance to then go back and set things right.
yeah. That's really important, because at the when we have those things that we carry forward with us, that that thought that we know we have, that we need to make amends and we don't deal with it, I think it leads to guilt, and then guilt leads to fear. Well, then we start making up our stories. Well, when I have the conversation, it's going to go like this, and this is what they're going to say. And we tend to play it out, and rather than have that conversation, we just avoid it.
Yeah, it's very easy to avoid those difficult conversations. And as I mentioned, I wasn't good at difficult conversations in the workplace,
Yeah,
and I rather avoided them. But that comes at a price, and then we're walking around overthinking about it, and we're carrying it with us. But these days, I know that I shouldn't go to bed with any of these pain points. And it's while first I cleaned up my past, I'm trying to now do it every day. So before I go to bed, I think through. Uh, the day. Did I say something that wasn't quite right? Did I send an email with a tone that wasn't nice? Then I have a chance
good.
before I go to bed to make those amends, to recall that and send a message or send another email and say, sorry, that didn't come out right. Let me give you a call tomorrow. And then we can go and have a good night's sleep. So it's about not carrying this pain with us.
Yeah, yeah. I love that, because I think that's one thing, Nick. I think that gets neglected is is dealing with those moments now, in the now, rather than putting them off to some point in the future. And the last one, I'm really interested in this one, which is finding your purpose.
Yeah, and I think many times as an executive or busy corporate in the corporate world, perhaps we make work our purpose. It feels like a purpose because companies are very good at providing a vision, a mission, goals, KPIs, bonuses. The whole
Oh yeah,
infrastructure is built up to perform, and we fall in, and it becomes our purpose. The danger with that is the day we lose that. If we are terminated, the company go through a merger acquisition, or we leave, or we retire, then does that mean that we lose our purpose? So here, I like us to go a lot deeper, and I do that now with my coaching clients. And in fact, I done some good work with John Mattone, the coach who did this with Steve Jobs during his last year. And it's
wow.
really about mapping out then what were the hobbies we like as a child, what really makes us going, what are the things that we like to do for others, and mapping all of these out and making a meaningful purpose. And when we do that, it's almost like we're writing our legacy at the same time.
Yeah, I love that. So how is it? What's it when it? Because I agree with you. I think as an executive, or wherever you are in any organization, right? It's easy to lose track of your purpose and succumb to motivation, right? Motivation is extrinsic. Motivation is something like you talked about, bonuses and KPIs. those are things that happen for something you do. That just, I do this and I get that. And purpose is more about inspiration at what gets you out of bed in the morning. You know, why you put your feet on the floor and put your pants on and go. Of course, you know, for men, I suppose I could say, I don't want to be too specific around that, but anyway, so I'm really kind of curious, as you know, as you work with, and it's fascinating that you got to work with a gentleman. So as people kind of get into that scenario, that conversation with you, I think a lot of times people don't know, they lose their purpose. They don't remember the purpose. And that moment of discovery, what's that discovery like for people kind of as they come back to, oh, that's what it was?
Yeah, so for a start, I say we can have multiple purposes in our lives. And if we have a job, that is one meaningful purpose. We're earning an income, we can feed ourselves, look after the family. So don't change that. That's a wonderful purpose. But then we should look for other purposes in our life. And I say it should be related to giving back, which is an important one. So what are the causes that we love? And everyone has a different love. Maybe we love dogs. Then look up a food shelter and double down on that and give back there. In my case, as I shared before, because I lost a friend to suicide, that became something that I wanted to give in, and that will remain my purpose. I keep supporting that organization in any way I can by giving back. And then I mentioned also that I went through a patch when I had some challenges with alcohol, and I'm coming up to 8 years sober now without alcohol here. And I've been giving back there. I've been supporting over 1,000 recovery meetings for others, people who are now struggling with alcohol. And this is something that I do daily. I will show up and be there for them and support them. And that has become my purpose, to support people with sobriety. I love to cycle. And if I look back at the photo albums of me as a child, my parents, as I asked them, what did I love to do as a child? My mom started to show me photo albums, and she shared pictures of me cycling as a young. So then it's about doubling down on that and doing more of that. So cycling in the nature and so on, and being part of cycling clubs and communities is another purpose of mine. And we all have these stories to show and share, and the old photo albums, and if we can dig them out, and then we will find some golden nuggets there. And in that way, I believe we can find our purposes.
Yeah, I think that's so important, and the fact that, you know, it goes back to your self-assessment, right? Inside the body of the self-assessment, all of the 8 domains that you talk about in there all linked together, ultimately tie together into a purpose. They all tie into kind of a whole life view, and your assessment on where am I today and where are my gaps. And one thing I do want to also just spend a moment on. You know, a lot of times I think when people hear the term giving back, there's a thought that goes into it, Nick, that giving is money.
Yes, isn't it, Donna?
Yeah.
Doland? And indeed, and I'm sitting in Southeast Asia, Thailand today. I'm in South Thailand, and we had the biggest rain in 300 years here last week. And to talk about giving back, yes, there's a time and place when perhaps money is needed. And I give you one example of that, because a couple of days ago, one of my friends, they were going to go to the supermarket with a car and buy groceries and go down there to some people who've been stranded in the flooding, and they were going to prepare lunch for them. Yes, then you and they sent pictures later on from the supermarket when they bought the groceries and they were down there feeding them. I think money is a good cause then in an emergency like that. However, it is about perhaps giving back giving our time, like I do for the alcohol community and the problem drinkers. Then it's about giving my experience. I was there, I understand you, and let's talk this through, and giving them a safe space to speak. And there's so many shapes and forms where we can give back.
Yeah, I think that's very important. There's one of my favorite writers is Thomas Troward, and he has a treatise on the spirit of opulence. And then in the spirit of opulence, he talks about that giving back doesn't have to be money. It can be time, giving back is not intended to drive someone into debt. It's to leverage the assets you have. So when as you're as you're doing the things that you're doing now, let's talk a little bit about, so when you're coaching and you're leading both, individual and group coaching, what kind of organizations do you, what kind of organizations do you like to work with? What resonates with you? When I ask this question, I'll put a little preamble into it, because I always tell my clients, look, I'm not for everybody, and everybody's not for me. And so I think, and there has to be a vibrational fit. There has to be a fit. So let's talk a little bit about the kind of clients that you like to work with, kind of where they are and kind of where you come into the conversation. Mostly because leaders, as you're listening to this, no leader can do what we do alone. It's a rule. You may think you can, but leaders can't do it alone. You need help. So I'm really curious kind of about where you come in, Nick, because it gives people a chance to know where I may need help, where they may need help, and be able to come back to you.
Yeah, and I absolutely love to work holistically. And what I mean with that is to look at all the different parts of our life. Thus, I always start with a self-assessment. Even when I'm employed to do business coaching for someone, I say, I want to know about your life, because how you show up at home will affect your performance at work. If you have broken relationships and arguments with your wife going on till 3-4 a.m. in the morning, how are you going to show up the next day? If you are unhealthy and you have insomnia, that will affect your performance at work. So it all goes a full circle. So the first I always do is do the self-assessment. And the first session is always talking through the whole life, where they are and where they want to go. So I get the holistic picture. And then from there, I start. So I'm less excited about working with someone who wants pure business coaching, just looking at the targets and how to achieve it.
Right.
That is quite simple, and I think that's an outdated view to look at things. So holistically is what I prefer to do my work, both on an individual level and on a group level. And let's just put it this way as well. I know that sometimes we say, we should be careful by talking about our problems, our fatal flaws, and so on. But we also say there's this school of thought saying that, well, if there's one fatal flaw and it's really affecting us, such as many times I shared before, so that health is the biggest one, then we should address our health for our own sake, but also for how we show up for our organization. And then we can look at all the other parts, and it will all have an impact on our performance.
Yeah, I love that, Nick. I think and leaders, listen to that carefully. Matter of fact, on your phone somewhere, there's a little rewind button. Go back about 90 seconds and listen to what Nick was just talking about. I would recommend that. And just because it is that thing, when we're out of alignment, when we're not congruent in our life, it impacts all other areas. And inversely, you mentioned, in relationship, if you're home arguing with your wife, you're going to show up terribly. If you're at work and you're terribly stressed, you're going to go home and it's going to be a terrible relationship. That balance, which in turn creates that, I call it the slow spiral of death. And then things can spin quickly and spin out of control. So when you are working with clients, as you mentioned, you start kind of holistically with the whole life assessment, and it's probably one last question, which is, I've never found an elegant way to end the podcast, so I just say this is the last question. So one last question, as you were developing the assessment and you were kind of identifying these areas, kind of what, and I love the areas that you've identified as part of the assessment. How did you identify these areas? What made you? Because a lot of people say there's only 4 quadrants or 2 quadrants or 1 quadrant, and what fascinated me was there was 8.
Yeah, and if you look at this, the 8 areas are described in what is called the wheel of life. So it comes from the wheel of life, which is a wheel, and it all holds together. And I just like also the detail of these 8 parts. And of course, if you look at these 8 parts and just look at health, you can break down to mental health, physical health, social health, emotional, and on it goes, right? But I believe we need these 8, and it's really about, if you see physical environment, it's also having a huge impact on you. Sometimes perhaps we pay too much money for where we live because we want to impress people who we don't care about. And this is very common for executives.
True.
One of the senior leaders I work with, he put in physical environment 3 on his current score and the desired score of 9. So I asked him, tell me about your place. Where do you live? Why is it a 3? He said, well, I live in the most expensive address inside Singapore. I live in a double penthouse and I don't feel like I belong here. And he was painting the picture of having this nice place where he could take clients and so on. But
Sure.
then when I asked him, so what does a 9 look like for you? He said, well, I grew up on a farm in Australia. You know, it was nice. I was close to nature. There was animals running around and so on. So that was a 9 to him. And then the next question is, okay, could you find something close to this in Singapore? And then he already started to paint the picture. Yeah, this area, there's landed houses there and so on. And after a few months, he had relocated. He had terminated his lease of this apartment and moved to a house. His children can run around in the garden. He's much happier. He built an outdoor mini gym on the roof of the house, and he feels much more grounded. And he saved himself a lot of money as well.
Sure. No, that's fantastic. But it's interesting you mentioned that, Nick, because I think that's those changes, we overlook those changes kind of based on what we assume are needed for prestige or image or appearance without really maintaining, truth to who we are. And for that, there's a price when we do those kinds of things. So that's why I really like the assessment. So, I want to do a couple of things. The very first thing is we're about the time I promised you we would be at the end of the podcast. We could keep going because I have other questions I could ask you, but a couple of things. The very first thing is, listeners, I'm going to encourage you to look at the show notes or go to nickjonsson.com and take the self-assessment that's there. And it's Nick, and the last is Jonsson, Jonsson, just so we're clear. But go there and take that self-assessment. And when I took the self-assessment, there was an email that came back immediately that said, here's where you are, here's your gaps, here's what we noticed. And so it's an instant response. It's not a self-assessment where you go away and it takes you a week to figure out what the heck is happening and you never hear anybody because it ends up in spam. It will come back immediately. So I suggest that you go do that. The second thing is in the show notes will be Nick's LinkedIn and his YouTube, but go take a closer look at what Nick is doing. The work that you're doing, and just from a closing gratitude, Nick, the work around loneliness, giving back, the 5 steps, taking stock, asking for help, getting healthy, nurturing healthy relationships, finding your purpose, helping executives and their teams do those things changes lives. And that's what empowerment's really all about. Because if we change those lives, we change other people's lives with it, just because of the gravity. So just want to tell you thank you for that and extend the last bit of gratitude today.
Thank you so much for having this meaningful conversation, Doland.
Yeah, it was a good conversation. Thank you. All right, listeners, always two things at the end of the podcast. The very first thing is, please, if you enjoyed today's podcast, give it a like, share, or follow. It has nothing to do with vanity numbers. It has to do with how technology works. Like, shares, follows, comments elevate the podcast, and it makes it easier for the podcast to be found, which helps you do the second thing. The second thing and the most important thing is share Nick's podcast with me today with another leader who may need to hear some of the things that Nick talked about. We're all on a mission together to empower 1 million leaders. That's my mission. And through doing that, sharing it, I can't do it by myself. Nick can't do it by himself, but collectively, we can do that easily. So share that podcast. Share what Nick talked about today. There's some really good insights today, Nick. Thank you for that again. So on that note, I thank everybody for being here. I'll see you on the next interview show podcast. I'm Doland White, the host. Thanks for being here with us today.
Thanks for listening to today's podcast. Be sure to give it a like, subscribe, or follow, and leave a comment about what you learned. And we'll see you on the next episode of The Next Interview.